BRICS Bulls Show daily podcast by and for you.
Hey everyone, ready to dive into some global power dynamics? We're looking at BRICS and their growing influence, especially after that G20 summit in Brazil. We've got this article from the BRICS joint website. It's called BRICS G20 Influence Strengthens, and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really is. It highlights how BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they're really becoming more assertive, I think, on the global stage. This isn't just like a one-time thing either. I think it's more of a trend. They're using platforms like the G20 to shape global conversations.
Yeah, they're not just happy to be there anymore. They want to actually set the agenda. And speaking of agendas, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov seemed pretty happy with how the summit went. He called the results positive, even highlighted BRICS' rising influence. Is this just talk, or is there something more to it?
That's a great question. I think there are a few things contributing to Lavrov's confidence. One big development is the African Union getting full membership in the G20. It strengthens the bloc of emerging economies and gives BRICS a powerful ally on key issues.
Yeah, it's like adding a whole continent to the conversation. And then there's the invitation to the Arab League leadership. That's even more representation within the G20.
Exactly. It aligns with BRICS wanting a more inclusive and representative structure for global governance. They've been pretty vocal about reforming institutions like the UN Security Council to give more voice to regions that haven't really had much say.
So it's not just about economic power then. It's about challenging the existing power structures and wanting a more balanced global order. But how about the economic side? What are some examples of BRICS' growing financial muscle?
Well, for example, Dilma Rousseff, the head of the New Development Bank, attended the G20 summit. That bank was established by BRICS nations. It offers an alternative to Western-dominated financial institutions, like the World Bank and IMF. It provides funding for infrastructure projects and development initiatives, especially in emerging economies.
So it's a way for BRICS to exert financial influence and support development on their own terms, almost creating a parallel financial system.
Exactly. BRICS is working to reshape the global financial landscape, and the New Development Bank is a key part of that.
It seems Lavrov pointed to a pattern of growing BRICS influence at the G20, not just in Brazil, but at the previous summits in India and Indonesia too. Let's talk about some of the issues they're highlighting on this global stage. Food security is a big one, right?
Absolutely. With rising populations and climate change, food security is a top priority for BRICS. And a major concern globally, of course. It's a complex issue, no easy solutions. But BRICS is pushing for collaborative efforts to address it.
Right. And then there's the call to restructure the global financial system. It's not just about having a seat at the table anymore. It's about reshaping the table itself. What does this restructuring entail?
Well, it's a pretty bold statement. Essentially, BRICS wants a more equitable system, one that reduces the dominance of Western currencies and financial institutions. They're pushing for reforms that give emerging economies a greater say in global financial governance.
So shifting the balance of power within the financial system. It's like they're aiming to create a whole new playing field.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're looking to level the playing field and establish a system that reflects the realities of a multipolar world.
And of course, they're also pushing for reform of global governance institutions, especially the UN Security Council, like we mentioned before. Lavrov specifically called for adding new permanent members to better represent the current global power structure.
Right. He mentioned including countries from Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean as permanent members. This would really change the power dynamics within the UN and give BRICS a more prominent voice in international affairs.
Wow, those are some serious changes. We're talking about potentially reshaping the entire global landscape.
It definitely shows that BRICS isn't content with the status quo anymore. They're actively trying to establish themselves as major players, and they're pushing for reforms that reflect their growing influence and ambitions.
It really seems like we're witnessing a major power shift. But BRICS isn't just advocating for these changes. They're taking action to forge new alliances and partnerships too, right?
Absolutely, and that's where Putin's partnership initiative comes in. This initiative aims to create stronger ties between BRICS and three key organizations: the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Hold on, that's a lot of acronyms, just so everyone's on the same page. The Eurasian Economic Union focuses on economic integration in Eurasia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes China and Russia. It's focused on security and cooperation. And the Association of Southeast Asian Nations promotes economic growth and regional stability in Southeast Asia. It sounds like a massive power play.
It is. And it's a strategic move to consolidate economic and political power. Across a huge geographical area, this partnership, if it works out, could create a really formidable bloc that rivals Western influence.
Okay, so we've got BRICS pushing for major reforms in global institutions, advocating for a more equitable financial system, and actively forging strategic alliances. But how did all of this play out at the G20 summit itself? What actually came out of those discussions?
Well, the G20 summit ended with a final declaration. It reflected some of the key themes we've been talking about. For example, there was a call for increased representation for countries in Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean on the UN Security Council.
Sounds familiar. Clearly the message resonated, even if they haven't figured out the specifics yet. Anything else stand out from the declaration?
Yeah, they also launched the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty.
It's interesting to see that kind of initiative alongside all the political maneuvering. It's like a reminder that even with these power shifts, there are still some really urgent, real-world problems that need solutions everyone can work on. Did the article say anything about how BRICS sees its role evolving?
The article says this is just the beginning. It emphasizes that BRICS will probably play an even bigger role in shaping the global economic agenda in the future.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. But let's step back for a second and look at the big picture. What does this all mean for the world? Are we really seeing a new world order, and what might that look like?
It's definitely possible. If BRICS keeps gaining influence and successfully pushes for these reforms, we could see a shift away from a world dominated by the West towards a more multipolar system.
Okay, so instead of one main power center, we'd have multiple power centers, each with its own sphere of influence. What kind of implications would that have on international relations? Would this make the world more cooperative or more competitive?
That's the big question. A multipolar world could bring more balance and cooperation, since different power centers would need to negotiate and collaborate to address global challenges. But it could also lead to more competition, maybe even conflict as these powers try to get resources and influence.
That's a good point. Like with any big change, there are potential benefits and risks. How might this impact things like global trade and economic development?
A multipolar world could lead to new trading blocs and partnerships. It could diversify global trade and create new opportunities for emerging economies. But it could also lead to more protectionism and trade wars as different blocs compete for economic dominance.
So there's a potential upside for countries that have been on the periphery of the global economy. But it's not a sure thing for anyone. And it could even create new sources of tension.
Exactly. It's important to remember that this potential shift isn't happening in isolation. Other factors are at play, like technology advancing quickly, climate change becoming more urgent, and demographics shifting. All of these things will shape how this new world order, if it happens, will actually work.
So we're not just talking about BRICS rising. We're talking about a whole bunch of things reshaping the world as we know it.
Yeah.
And it's happening right now. It could impact all of our lives. What are some of the most important things for people to keep in mind as they watch these developments?
I think it's crucial to stay informed and think critically. Don't just believe headlines or sound bites. Dig deeper. Consider different perspectives. And question your own assumptions. The world is getting more and more complex, and understanding these shifts takes a nuanced approach.
That's great advice. It's easy to get caught up in the hype or the fear, but it's important to look at it all critically and with an open mind. Speaking of thinking critically, that partnership initiative Putin proposed is really interesting, bringing together the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and ASEAN. That's a bold move.
It is. If you look at a map, those organizations cover a massive area. It's much of Eurasia and a lot of the world's population.
It's almost like they're creating a new center of gravity, a counterweight to the West.
I think you're right. This partnership initiative isn't just about economics or politics. It's about geopolitics. It's about shifting the global balance of power.
So what would happen if that shift took place? Could this lead to a more divided world, with different blocs fighting for resources and influence? Or could it create new opportunities for cooperation and shared prosperity?
That's something we'll have to see. There are a lot of potential outcomes, both good and bad, and they depend on a lot of things. But one thing's for sure, we're living in a time of huge transformation, and the choices we make today will decide what the world looks like tomorrow.
And those choices aren't just being made by world leaders, they're being made by everyday people like you. So to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question to think about. How do you see these global shifts impacting your own life? What opportunities and challenges do you see coming? And how do you plan to deal with this changing world?
Yeah, those are some great questions. I encourage everyone listening to really think about those. The world is changing, and we all have a part to play in how it changes.
It's a lot to think about. We've been talking about BRICS challenging things, wanting a multipolar world, making new alliances. It seems like they want more economic and political influence globally. But what does it all mean for, regular people? How could these changes actually affect our everyday lives?
That's what matters, right? It might seem abstract, but these global shifts can have real effects. For example, a multipolar world could mean more diverse supply chains. Right now, a lot of essential goods and resources depend on just a few key players. With BRICS becoming more influential economically, we might see alternative sources popping up, maybe making those goods more accessible and less expensive.
So we wouldn't be so reliant on one region for things like technology or raw materials. We'd have more options, more competition, maybe even better prices.
Exactly. A multipolar world could also open up new investment opportunities. Emerging economies are growing, and so are their markets. That could be good for businesses and investors if they're looking to diversify and find new areas of growth.
That does sound promising. But you said before that a multipolar world could also mean more competition, maybe even conflict. What would that look like?
Well, one concern is that this shift in power could lead to geopolitical tension. As these new power centers appear, they might start clashing over things like resources, territory, or even just different ways of thinking. Think about maritime trade routes, access to energy, even who controls new technologies. These could all become flashpoints.
So even though a multipolar world could bring more balance, it doesn't necessarily mean everyone will get along. There could be new problems. As these power centers compete, this is a lot to take in. Any final thoughts for our listeners, things they should remember as they see these events unfold?
I think the main thing is that the world is interconnected. What happens in one place affects everyone else. These changes with BRICS and the whole geopolitical scene will have an impact everywhere on things like global trade, finance, climate action, even international security.
It reminds us that we're all connected, even if it doesn't always feel like it. These aren't just news stories. They're shaping the world we live in. We've talked about what might happen, good and bad. But no one knows for sure what the future holds. It all depends on the choices we make as individuals, and the choices we make together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.